Imagine a king whose appetite for power was only rivaled by his appetite for pleasure. A man who reshaped a nation, waged wars, and orchestrated marriages and executions with equal fervor, but whose private life was equally, if not more, notorious. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the hidden, often shocking sexual practices throughout history. Today we plunge into the dark, obsessive bedroom life of Henry VIII, England's most infamous monarch. From his youth, Henry was a man of extremes. He was celebrated for his charm, athleticism, and charisma, a king who loved music, hunting, and tournaments, but also one whose private desires would terrify and shock even the most seasoned historian. What many fail to grasp is that Henry's sexual life was far from ordinary. He treated women as instruments of power, status, and personal gratification, and his obsessions were intertwined with the political and religious upheavals of the Tudor court. In his early years, Henry was known for his vigor and insatiable desire. His marriages were not just political alliances but also arenas for lust, control, and domination. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, was initially the object of his youthful desire. Yet as years passed, Henry's impatience for a male heir twisted into obsession, jealousy, and cruelty. He scrutinized every aspect of their intimacy, always calculating, always measuring whether she could give him the son he craved. It is said that Henry's obsession with male heirs led him to meticulously document the queen's menstrual cycles, inspecting her for any sign of fertility or lack thereof. He demanded obedience, and failure meant humiliation, emotional cruelty, and ultimately divorce or worse. But his sexual appetite was not limited to the political sphere. Henry surrounded himself with courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and servants who became pawns in a complex dance of desire, surveillance, and power. Court life revolved around elaborate rituals, public displays of affection, and private liaisons that often blurred the lines between duty and deviance. Rumors swirled about clandestine encounters, secret rendezvous, and even coercion disguised as romance. Chroniclers of the time hinted at practices that were less than savory, hinting at a monarch who approached intimacy with the same meticulous control he applied to governance. These whispered tales reveal a man fascinated by the human body, obsessed with domination, and relentless in pursuit of personal gratification. It was a dangerous blend. His charisma drew people in, but his unpredictability kept them in fear. It was in this charged atmosphere that Henry's obsessions flourished, mingling sexual desire with cruelty and control, leaving a trail of scandal that would echo for centuries. His story is a stark reminder that history often hides its most lurid truths behind the veneer of crowns, ceremonies, and royal decrees. And for those willing to look, the Tudor court offers a window into the darker side of human desire, power, and obsession. By the time Henry turned 30, his reputation as a formidable lover was well established, yet it carried a darkness few dared to speak of. It was no secret that Henry's relationships often mixed genuine attraction with an almost obsessive need for control. The notorious Anne Boleyn, for instance, captured Henry's imagination like no other. She was clever, beautiful, and ambitious, a woman who challenged the king, yet became the object of his intense, relentless pursuit. Henry's courtship of Anne was as much psychological warfare as romantic endeavor. He courted her with a mixture of gifts, flattery, and manipulation, creating an intricate web of desire and power that left the nation's clergy and courtiers astounded. Their private encounters were reported to be charged with intensity, but the king's obsession soon revealed its darker side. Henry demanded absolute loyalty and attention, often pushing Anne to emotional and sexual submission. The boundary between seduction and coercion in their relationship was blurred, and Anne's eventual execution hints at the perilous intersection of intimacy, ambition, and political machination in Henry's life. Sexual desire for Henry was never separate from political calculation. Every encounter, every affair, and even every marriage was a tool to consolidate authority. Beyond Anne, Henry engaged in a series of liaisons that historians describe as both reckless and strategic. Women of the court, from attendants to visiting dignitaries, were observed, evaluated, and sometimes exploited to satisfy the king's whims. Chroniclers note that Henry delighted in control over the female body, insisting that his desires be fulfilled according to his precise specifications. Yet obsession often came with grotesque extremes. Henry's later years reveal a man struggling with illness, obesity, and a deteriorating body, yet his sexual appetite remained potent. Accounts suggest that he experimented with positions, indulgences, and fantasies that reflected both a creative erotic mind and a deep-seated need to assert dominance. At the same time, Henry's paranoia grew. He feared betrayal, infidelity, and disrespect, punishing even minor perceived slights with public humiliation or violent reprisal. His obsessions extended to monitoring the chastity and loyalty of his wives, often employing spies, informants, and loyal courtiers to report on their actions. The combination of lust, obsession, and fear created a court atmosphere fraught with tension and intrigue. Everyone knew that pleasure with Henry could be fleeting and dangerous, and yet the allure of proximity to the king, of touching the crown's power even momentarily, was irresistible to many. Through these intricate relationships, one sees the contours of a man whose sexuality was inseparable from his identity as monarch, dominating, demanding, and driven by an insatiable hunger that extended far beyond physical satisfaction into the very machinery of political power. Henry's sexual practices were as much about control as they were about pleasure, and nowhere was this more evident than in his obsession with secrecy and voyeurism. The king often staged elaborate scenarios that allowed him to observe, manipulate, and dominate without being fully seen himself. Reports suggest that Henry took particular interest in the private lives of his courtiers, orchestrating situations where loyalty and desire were tested under his watchful eye. He was fascinated by the tension between public decorum and private indulgence, frequently exploiting the gap for his own gratification. These practices were not mere eccentricities. They were exercises of power, reinforcing his status as king and his ability to bend everyone and everything to his will. His fascination extended to voyeuristic pleasures, with anecdotes describing Henry observing intimate encounters between others, both as entertainment and as a means of studying human behavior for his own benefit. This was an era in which sexual propriety was tightly regulated, and the king's willingness to transgress those boundaries only amplified his mystique and authority. There were also darker aspects, with historians suggesting Henry's experiments sometimes involved coercion or humiliation, turning intimacy into a display of dominance. Women and men alike were caught in the web of his obsession, their fear mingling with fascination as they navigated the treacherous currents of courtly life. Beyond the royal bedchamber, Henry's obsession with control extended to objects and rituals. He demanded specific furnishings, clothing, and even lighting for intimate encounters, showing a meticulous attention to sensory experience that bordered on the pathological. Every encounter was curated, every reaction observed, and every detail recorded in the king's mind. These practices, while shocking to modern sensibilities, reveal a pattern. Henry's sexuality was inseparable from his need to dominate, strategize, and manipulate. It was a performance that was both private and political, blending desire with fear, pleasure with power. Even within the confines of marriage, Henry's lust for experimentation and control never waned. The interplay of secrecy, surveillance, and obsession created a psychological landscape in which his partners were simultaneously desired, scrutinized, and terrified. These intimate games shaped not only the lives of those around him, but also the course of English history, influencing marriages, alliances, and the succession of the throne itself. In examining these practices, we see a monarch whose erotic life cannot be disentangled from his ambition, paranoia, and hunger for control, a combination that made him both terrifying and fascinating, and whose legacy continues to captivate historians and storytellers alike. The pattern of obsession and domination continued through Henry's marriages, each one revealing new facets of his sexual and psychological character. Jane Seymour, his third wife, was the fulfillment of a long-sought goal, a male heir. Henry's desire for a son drove him to extremes, both in intimacy and in life-or-death decisions surrounding court politics. With Jane, The king reportedly engaged in more tender yet still intensely controlled sexual practices. He was deeply attentive, almost desperate in his pursuit of conception, scrutinizing the queen's body and monitoring every cycle, every reaction, as if the nation's future depended entirely on their private encounters. Yet even in success, with the birth of Edward VI, Henry's appetite did not wane. He quickly sought new liaisons and partners, demonstrating that his desire was as much about personal obsession as dynastic necessity. Following Jane's death, Anne of Cleves was introduced as part of a diplomatic arrangement, but Henry's sexual and emotional response to her was one of repulsion, highlighting his insistence on personal gratification above all else. These personal preferences, his desire for specific physical attributes, his insistence on particular behaviors, illustrate a man whose sexuality was tightly intertwined with his ego and perception of power. When Catherine Howard entered the scene, Henry's obsession with youth and novelty reached new heights. He demanded complete submission and unwavering attention, punishing perceived indiscretions with swift brutality. Catherine's eventual execution underscores the perilous intersection of lust, obsession, and authority in the Tudor court. With each marriage, each liaison, Henry experimented with control, dominance, and pleasure in ways that were meticulously recorded by observers and chroniclers. What stands out is not just the intensity of desire, but the variety of practices and the psychological depth of his obsessions. Sexuality for Henry was never casual. It was an instrument, a tool, and a performance that reinforced his status as the ultimate authority. These chapters of lust and control also highlight a more disturbing side: Henry's willingness to use fear, humiliation, and coercion to satisfy his appetites. The line between consent and domination was perilously thin, and those who crossed it often met dire consequences. His legacy, therefore, is a cautionary tale of desire fused with power, demonstrating how personal obsession can reshape not only individual lives, but the course of history itself. As Henry aged, his health deteriorated, yet his sexual obsession did not. Chroniclers describe a king increasingly tormented by pain, weight gain, and illness, yet still consumed by desire. The intensity of his practices evolved with his body, becoming less about stamina and more about psychological and ritualistic control. He surrounded himself with younger men and women, employing them as instruments to satisfy fantasies, observe behavior, and maintain his dominance. Henry's court became a theater of sexual display, with the king both observer and participant in acts that were often elaborate, performative, and calculated to assert power. These behaviors were intertwined with superstition, religion, and political calculation, reflecting a mind that saw desire, loyalty, and authority as inseparable. One of the most startling aspects of Henry's later sexual life was the meticulous cataloging of partners and experiences. Accounts suggest he kept mental notes, or encouraged others to keep written reports, of encounters, evaluating responses, physical traits, and emotional reactions. It was an obsession bordering on the pathological, yet it illuminates a king whose intelligence, curiosity, and lust were inseparable. Henry's sexual practices also intersected with the era's evolving notions of morality and propriety. While outwardly adhering to religious and societal norms, he frequently subverted these rules in private, demonstrating both a rebellious streak and a deep understanding of power dynamics. His ability to manipulate appearances, maintain secrecy, and exploit vulnerability reveals a monarch whose erotic life was as strategic as it was voracious. Observers and historians alike have remarked on the almost theatrical nature of Henry's obsessions, noting how he curated environments, orchestrated encounters, and manipulated emotions to achieve a sense of ultimate control. It was a performance in which pleasure, fear, and authority were intertwined, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who came into his orbit. Through these late years, the picture that emerges is of a man for whom sexuality was never simple or private. It was a lens through which he understood the world, exercised power, and navigated relationships, leaving a legacy both fascinating and horrifying in its intensity. Reflecting on the life of Henry VIII, one cannot separate the man from his obsessions. His sexual practices reveal a monarch whose desires were inseparable from his authority, ego, and psychological complexity. The Tudor court was a crucible of lust, control, fear, and intrigue, where every encounter carried weight, risk, and consequence. Henry's obsession shaped the lives of queens, concubines, courtiers, and even the trajectory of English history itself. The stories of coercion, domination, and intense desire offer both shock and insight, illuminating a human psyche driven by extremes. Yet they also reveal universal truths about power, desire, and the dangers of unbridled obsession. In exploring these dark bedroom secrets, we see a man who combined brilliance with cruelty, charm with terror, and insatiable desire with relentless control. His sexuality was both personal and political, intimate and performative, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate historians and storytellers alike. As we close this exploration of Henry VIII's terrifying sexual practices, we invite you to reflect. Which aspect of his life shocked you the most? Was it his obsessive control over his wives, his voyeuristic tendencies, or the sheer intensity of his desires even into old age? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories uncovering the hidden history of sex and sexuality across the ages. The lives of historical figures often hide shocking truths beneath layers of power, decorum, and ceremony, and through examining them we gain a deeper understanding not only of the past but of human nature itself.